and welcome back to Ghouls Night In, the spooky chat show with your best ghoul friends. I'm Penny Snark.
And I'm Midge Munster. Um, I already used this line in our most recent episode, so I feel silly reusing it now, but I have it written down, so I have to. But hi, gay! Happy Pride Month!
Hey! Hi,
It's
gay!
officially Pride Month,
Bow, bow,
um,
bow.
and I wanted to, of course, start our Pride Month off by talking about something gay because we
Excellent.
should.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah! So today I want to talk a little bit about queer representation in horror films.
Mm.
And I know we have addressed this a little bit kind of from a third party lens when we did like our Queer for Fear recap. But this is kind of more through my own lens. And I do just want to say up front that, of course, we are going to be talking about both the positive and unfortunately a lot of the negative representation of
Mm.
queer people in horror today. So we are going to be dealing with topics of homophobia and transphobia, as well as touching on some racism and things like that. So just so that you have that up front, there are some sensitive topics in here, but we will try to handle them with as much care as possible.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, as we've talked about before, especially with our Queer for, if you haven't listened to our Queer for Fear episode recap, now's a great time to go listen. It's a great
You
episode.
should. It's really good. It's very good.
It's a great, and go watch it as well. Rewatch Queer for Fear. It's June. But horror as a genre is inherently political, and it deals with survival, and most of the storylines include some degree of social commentary throughout the entire genre. Even if it's mostly through subtext, we can find representation of queer people all throughout history of horror. Unfortunately, though, through that we also have ended up with things like the bury your gays trope and queer people being portrayed heavily as villains in horror
Womp
and
womp.
film as a whole. That's also just like riddled through like Disney animation and
Oh,
all kinds of
yes. Oh,
things.
yes.
Villains are very queer coded. But there have also been some great representations of queer people and trans people in the last several years. And horror was showing us on screen long before we were represented anywhere else. And so, like I said, we're going to take a very abridged journey through the representation of queer people, the good, the bad, and the ugly in the horror genre. And I was telling Penny right before we started recording, I was like, I don't know what this is gonna. I could have literally written a like doctoral thesis.
Yeah.
I started going, I was like, there's so much here. So this is gonna be very abridged. Obviously, there's so much to unpack here. So take time this month and every month to research these things and see the history. It's very fascinating. But like I said, when it comes to horror, a lot of LGBTQ plus characters are painted as villains. And we just came out of talking about this in our Exorcist episode. That is thanks to a little thing we call the Hays Code.
Boo.
Boo! Because from 1934 to 1967, the film industry censored anything that was considered to be perverse in nature. And that, of course, extended to any sort of homosexual representation and at all. And the only way that queer people could be shown on screen is if they were shown as evil.
Boo.
Oh no. So the Hays Code, again, we could go on forever. It was so problematic on so many levels, not only because it was homophobic, but it was also aggressively racist.
Mm-hmm.
And even though the code was overturned 50 plus years ago now, we are still seeing so many lasting effects in today's media that Hollywood is just like refusing to reckon with. And it's very sad. It definitely set a standard for cinema in general. And the ripple effects are really sad.
Yeah, I did want to something that I thought of after the Exorcist episode, so I'm glad we're
Mm-hmm.
bringing it up again.
Yeah, come on round.
Is they talk about the Hays Code a lot in Queer for Fear, but I
Mm-hmm.
would also really recommend there's an episode of You're Wrong about the
Mm.
movie rating system that has Karina Longworth of You Must Remember This, which is a Hollywood history podcast, and so they talk a lot about the Hays Code and how it led to the modern rating system, and it's very
Nice.
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
If
very
anyone wants to deep dive into
yeah, deep
that
dive.
specifically.
Oh yeah, especially yeah, if you're a film person, if that's something you love, it's so important also just to kind of see how that has shaped the landscape of media
Yes.
forever. Like it has literally changed every practice and everything we do. Um, but when we talk about Hays Code era horror, the first film I have to take a pit stop at is 1936's Dracula's Daughter.
Dun, dun, dun.
Duh, if you've not seen Dracula's Daughter, this is one of the most loudly sapphic films of all time, and it has absolutely zero mentions of homosexuality in it whatsoever because it's during the Hays Code, but it is loudly gay without ever having to say a word. The main plot of this film is that the Countess, who is the daughter of Count Dracula, her name is Maria, and she takes a very strong interest in a female victim. And the film is taking place after the death of Count Dracula. I think I already said that, maybe. Whoops. um, basically, the Countess is now convinced that because Dracula is dead, her curse of wink, wink, vampirism,
Mm.
wink, wink, will be lifted from her and that she will be cured of her ailment. Uh, and there's so much subtext here. There's a scene where Maria like confides in her assistant that her curse is finally going to be lifted and she will be able to like quote live a normal life and think normal thoughts,
Ah, yes.
you
Those
know.
normal non-vampire thoughts.
Right. uh and this desperation to be like cured of her inner turmoil ends up leading to her seeking help from a psychiatrist, high conversion therapy, and everything about the subtext of this film is a queer woman working through trying to convince herself she's not queer.
Hmm.
The camera work, the underscoring, the overall tone of the film is all of this like these long shots of her like longing after female victims, and she has I think one male victim, and that scene is like bite done, like it's not, she's like bye, doesn't care,
Bye.
boy bye. And then every other scene with like Lily and the other like females are these long like seductive hypnosis. She's like looking over their bodies for 20 minutes. It's so queer. And this is kind of recognized as the earliest lesbian vampire trope, which becomes a ringing thing we see throughout horror cinema moving forward. But it also, of course, is problematic in a lot of
Yeah.
ways because here the queer person is predatory. The
Yep.
idea of her lesbianism is that she is seeking out people to attack, more or less. And unfortunately, again, with our Hays Code, uh, the lesbian undertones of this film are specifically used to like increase repulsion in the audience, to shock and
Mm.
upset, and so the horror there is homosexuality. Very problematic, and we see this through all the classic monster films. You can find it; they're all just like laden with queer subtext. But this one in particular, I think, is a really important watch if you're brushing up on your queer horror history. Uh, and like I said, because of this, we're seeing this. It sets a standard, and even in a post Hays Code world, we still see a lot of instances of queer characters in horror that are only shown to us in a subtextual format. Uh, and you know, I had to talk about this. Do you know where we're going, Penny? 1985.
Is it The Bride of Frankenstein?
No, not in
Oh,
1985.
1985. I was already thinking. I was
but
thinking about
but
you already
Bride
had
is
me in a classic horror
I know.
mindset,
Bride
man.
is a lipstick lesbian. That's just a
Yes.
fact. That whole movie is about her repulsion of men and or yeah, of men, repulsed by men.
Men?
Anyway,
Yeah.
she's queer and we all know it. I do claim her as my mother. There's also they talk about that in Queer for Fear, which is something I totally missed. watching it, just like the idea of this man obsessed with creating life without a woman.
Mhm.
Like, I don't know. So many things. We could go on. Could have literally just done the monster films for 45 minutes. Um, but in 1985, this film, I think, plays well off of Dracula's Daughter. We get Nightmare on Elm Street
Oh,
too.
yes. Nightmare on Elm Street.
And this is another of my personal favorite queer horror films. And this is a lot of people's absolute least favorite film in the Nightmare franchise. And I have a bone to pick with all of you. I understand that it is definitely outside of the franchise in the way that, like, Freddy is different in this one. But I love this movie, and not just because my uncle is the star of it. But Freddy's Revenge is a film full of very not so quiet subtext, and our main character Jesse is our scream king. Absolute love him. And he's that's not, like, quote, not the point of the film, but he's definitely coming to terms with his sexuality. And the the crummy thing here is that the writer of this film will up and down swear that there was no intent of there being any queer subtext in this film.
Hmm.
However, have you seen Nightmare on Elm Street too?
I have not.
Okay. When
I,
you if
I'm familiar. I am
yeah,
familiar with it. I have
if
not
and when
actually
you
watched
watch
it.
this, you'll be like, "What?"
I was gonna say I know enough about it to know that it is infamously gay.
Yeah, jam-packed. There's literally a gay bar scene where Jesse, like, runs into his gym coach in, like, full cross-dressing, like, BDSM attire, and there's, like, homoerotic sport montage, like, I mean, it's just the gayest thing you've ever seen. And, of course, we can't forget the classic line, when Freddy is taking over Jesse's body, and Jesse says, and I quote, "He's inside me, and he wants to take me again."
Ah,
But it's not gay, guys.
not gay at all.
It's not gay, okay?
You know when a man's inside you and wants to take you in a totally not
In
gay
a
way,
bro way,
in
in a
just this really
homey way.
straight villainous way.
Yeah, no homo, bro. uh, so here again, and at the I love this movie, but it makes me mad. At the height of the freaking AIDS crisis, no less,
Mhm.
we have once again a film showing homosexuality as the monster that is, like, literally taking over a young boy's life and body as he fights to, like, quote, stay normal, right?
Mhm.
And while this film has since become a queer classic, um, it's just blatantly homophobic, unfortunately,
Yeah.
um, especially even, like, down to the way it was produced. So, as I blipped over a second ago, Mark Patton, who plays Jesse, is my uncle, and he also has a great documentary on Shudder called Scream Queen: My Nightmare on Elm
Mhm.
Street. Great watch, about the the way this film kind of unfortunately ruined his life in a lot of ways, even though it also propelled him to stardom much later. Um, he more or less got outed very publicly
Yeah.
during the AIDS crisis because of this film. And a quote, this is a quote from him, that he said, "I always thought the real villain in my story was David Chaskin, the writer. He insisted for so many years that he hadn't written it as a gay film, but I knew that he had. He would always blame it on me and say, well, I didn't write it that way, but Mark was just so gay that he made the whole movie gay."
Boo.
uh, so very problematic in a lot of ways, but also again a great for so many people the first time they saw someone on screen who was them, you
Mhm.
know?
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
I'm sure this will come up, and we talked about semi this kind of stuff in Queer for Fear, but it's both it's sad but also heartening how many like things that were just like shitty and homophobic that queer people have been like, nope, actually,
actually,
I'm
we're
taking this
reclaiming that.
back. I like this. So
Absolutely.
too
Yeah.
bad.
And
You can't use this against me because I'm gonna like it.
exactly. And yeah, unfortunately, up to the last few years, most
Yeah, because
most
we were
things
we were
are like
forced
that.
to do that
Right,
because that was
exactly.
your only option to
And
see
that's, yeah, the
queerness.
story for so many any type of marginalized people for a,
Yeah.
like, I mean,
Mhm.
there's the representation that you receive is what you have, and whether it's great or not, it's what you have. Speaking of which, let's talk about trans representation kind of in horror.
Uh-oh.
Uh, yeah. Now, Penny, you already touched on this a bit in our Silence of the Lambs episode.
Mhm.
And we're going to talk about another trope that is the quote cross-dressing serial killer unquote. Uh, so obviously, in Silence of the Lambs, we have our killer, James Gum or Buffalo Bill, and I've now seen this film,
Yes.
which I had not at the time that we discussed it. So now I actually have context and lots of thoughts and feelings. I will say, as a whole, I thought this was one of the best films I've ever watched, just cinematically. I was like, wow, that's a great freaking film. Um, but unfortunately, it also comes with its problems because
Yep.
Buffalo Bill's gender identity is handled in a number of very problematic ways. Um, he is, like I said, a classic uh, version of this killer transgender trope. And that's kind of originally made famous by Psycho, Alfred
Mhm.
Hitchcock. Norman Bates obviously dresses up as his mother to kill because that's apparently a thing people think people do.
Sure.
um, but very specifically, what I want to talk with Silence of the Lambs is that one of the most standout scenes in this film is where Buffalo Bill is dressing up in front of a mirror, kind of has a fabric on, tucks, and is posing wearing the scalp of one of their victims. Um, and the reason, like, it's a very like jarring scene because this person's wearing the scalp of
Yeah.
a woman.
As
Um,
previously mentioned, he
right.
is
And
wearing
like,
someone's scalp.
right. So there's that. And like, we've got a victim in the other room, like at the bottom of a well, screaming help at the top of their lungs, and everything's happening. Um, but it's this juxtaposition of the idea that like Buffalo Bill putting on femme identity is being portrayed just as sinister as murder.
Yeah.
um, and the end effect, whether or not that's the intent, is showing trans femme people as inherently violent towards cis women in order
Mhm.
to achieve femininity. And while obviously this is shown like in an extreme version in Silence of the Lambs, like literally killing women to gain their skin to be feminine, um, that is a very real fear that is perpetuated in so many ways still today. I while I was thinking about this, I kept specifically thinking about Dylan Mulvaney
Yeah.
because like the way that I see, if you don't know Dylan, she's a trans woman on TikTok who has done this series of has been very just like public about her transition. And of course, people have taken it upon themselves to attack her in every way
Of
possible.
course.
Um, and there's this repetitive thing I see when people are looking for ways to tear her down, where they're saying things that, like, basically that somehow she is stealing something away from cis women
Yeah.
by living in her truth. And so I really feel like representations like Silence of the Lambs are perpetuating the stigma that like trans femme people are literally taking from cis women
Yeah.
in some way, when obviously that is not an accurate representation. Uh, and when we talk about transphobia in horror, we obviously have to make a little stop at Sleepaway Camp. Penny, I have to ask again: have you seen Sleepaway Camp?
I have not seen
I
Sleepaway
was
Camp.
guessing probably not. This one's more of a deep cut. And again, another one that has been kind of like reclaimed as a queer classic.
Mhm.
Um, but big spoilers. This I am gonna just talk about the end of this movie because we have to. The twist ending to this film is that our killer, Angela, is revealed to have, like, quote, been a man the whole time.
Ugh.
Ugh.
Ooh.
Whoa. And it's it's just like this cheap
Yeah.
construct, which
Mhm.
I don't want to shit on this movie because I do think in a lot of ways it's an important film. Felissa Rose is an incredible actress. Like there's so many good things about this movie. Um, but it's this cheap trick of like continuing to make the villain seem even more strange and distant from society than they already were by being, a murderer.
Right,
By
yeah.
them being like, and also they're
But also
transgender. The
yeah,
worst thing a person can be.
it's portrayed as, like, an ultimate deception.
Exactly. And so yeah, you've led perfectly into this.
Sorry.
Like, no, 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 no. Yeah, I'm glad that you're there with me because, like, in some way, horror wants to shock, scare, or make you uneasy, right? That's the whole
Yep.
point. And so, Sleepaway Camp unfortunately does that by exploiting homosexuality and trans panic.
Yeah.
And the whole ending of this film is so freaking bizarre. It ends very abruptly. There's no closure. Like the end of this film is we get Angela's identity through flashbacks, and they're like, she's actually her dead brother Peter, and her aunt forced her to live as a girl, and also her dad was gay and somehow that's important. Like it's just the weirdest
Yeah.
thing, and so we get all this information very rapidly in these flashbacks that feel very oh, what's it called when you subliminal, like it's like,
Yeah.
oh, the horror of gayness. And then we see Angela with her naked body and her genitalia, and then the film's like over, and that's the whole thing. It's very bizarre and
Yeah.
jarring, and not jarring in the way I think they thought they were achieving. It's
Yeah.
jarring in the like, oh my god, what? Like in a queer horror way, like for queer people being like, oh god,
Yeah, like,
because it
"What? Why are you
uh,
doing this?"
who, yeah, like it just, like I said, we've reclaimed it in a lot of queer spaces. I'm sure there are also, I cannot speak for trans people. I'm sure there are plenty of people who would just shit on this movie, and
Yeah.
that's valid too. Um, but it relies again on this idea that queer and trans people are like insidiously infiltrating straight spaces with the intent to do harm to heterosexual people. uh, and it's so tricky because again, this is one of the only places in horror where we have a transgender woman, though also the writers of this film will again swear up and down like, well, that's not, she's not trans, it's that she's a boy and she was forced to live as a woman. I'm like, okay, well,
Ah, yes.
whatever you say, Jeremy. So that with all of these negative representations, like I said, there are also thousands of examples of people who watched these things, however problematic, and saw themselves on screen for the first time.
Yep.
But are there good representations of queer people in horror? And if so, what does that look like? Uh, because a lot of times, if we are not villainized, queer characters are dead.
Yep. On the chopping block.
Yeah, and as we kind of touched on earlier, there is this barrier gaze trope. This is not exclusive to horror, it's all over the
Oh,
place,
yes.
in cinema and media and everything. And in a great roundabout way, they still found a way to demonize queer people through this trope, because as we discussed in our slasher episode, horror movies are also like based on the idea of morality,
Mhm.
and people like that are having sex, that are sluts or whatever, are punished for their sins by death, right, in these films. Like the final girl is a lot of times like a pious virginal woman because she's like made quote good choices.
Yeah, the purest.
The pure. And so pretty frequently, once a queer person is outed in a horror film, once we gain the knowledge that this character is gay, then they usually die pretty soon after that because they're being like, what? That's, I mean, not that anyone ever expressly says that, but that they get more or less, quote, punished,
Yep.
right? For being queer. Um, so that sucks. But I will say, in the last several years, we're starting to see a reversal of this trope, and it's really
Yay!
exciting. One of my favorite examples of the full reversal, like literally the most hardcore reversal of the barrier gaze trope I've ever seen, is in the new sci-fi series, the Chucky series, the
Mhm.
television. So first of all, Chucky as a franchise is very gay. It always has been. Now it has been with its own problems. If you've ever seen Seed of Chucky, Chucky has a child, Glenn slash Glenda, who is non-binary, and the series has finally confirmed that. But there were a series of problematic issues with Seed of Chucky as well. Like, again, we're seeing non-binary representation, but there's also this very problematic scene where like they literally check in Glenn's pants. Like, it's
Ugh.
just there,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's had its own string of issues, but they were touching on things long before a lot of people even knew what the word non-binary was, right? Um, so now in the series, we have confirmed non-binary representation in Glenn Glenda, which is very exciting. But also, in the very first episode of the Chucky series, our protagonist is a gay man, and that's exciting, let alone. But in the very first episode, his homophobic father gets absolutely smoked,
Noise.
and it was such a like double down on like we're rooting for the queers in this series, and it didn't feel like signally. It was like, this is what we're about in this series, and that was very exciting. The show is just really unapologetically queer and has like a nice queer love story amongst everything else that's happening, because not every queer person has to go through a horror show just experiencing nothing but
Yeah.
drama. It's amazing. Uh, we've also, of course, had lots of lesbian protagonists in the last couple of years in both the Fear Street franchise and the Scream franchises. Now, I will not go too deep here because obviously Scream is still very new, and especially the most recent film is very
Mhm.
new. Um, we are, I will just say, there are definitely still things we're working on. There's still things we're working on, and that's okay. However, seeing like strong, intelligent, and also very importantly in both Fear Street and Scream, Black and Latina lesbian characters
Hey.
spearheading those storylines is like a really exciting change of pace, and I think we're seeing uh, a lot of people trying to actively reckon with the past of horror. Now, granted, a lot of these writers and creators are queer people.
Hey.
Because representation is so important in all facets, full stop. But like, especially with horror, the fan base of the genre is so queer, right? Horror draws so many of our kind because we can relate to the otherness that a lot of these characters experience, and so it only makes sense to tell LGBTQ stories in these films and not just in a way that makes us the monster.
Yep.
And it's exciting to see those shifts starting to happen, because I think even queer people making movies felt like they had to play into those tropes for so long in order to be seen at all,
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
I mean, Kevin Williamson, writer of Scream, as we
Yes.
have talked about, is a queer man, and I feel like we're finally, here he's been like owning the horror game for 2 decades, and we're just now finally seeing uh, a story about a queer person being like told well in his franchise, and as soon as we give ourselves the permission to tell our stories, I think the rest will follow. So I'm hopeful, even though
Yes.
we spent a lot of this episode talking about
Bad
you know,
examples.
bad examples. But also, I think it's important for us to revisit just where we've been, so that we can continue to learn and grow, and take, take whatever you want from those films. You're allowed to love a problematic film if you understand it's problematic.
Yes.
So please, if I have crapped on any of your favorite films today, I apologize. But please know that these are all in my canon of favorites, and I understand. I understand why people love them, and I understand why people hate them equally.
Yep. Sometimes you gotta give tough love to the things that you love the most because you're like,
Yes,
all right, we can do better.
exactly. We can, and we are, and we will, and I'm excited.
Hell yeah.
And with that being said, happy Pride Month, everybody.
Happy Pride
Go
Month.
out, make queer horror, make it good, make it exciting. Um, like I said, this was so abridged. There were a gajillion other examples we could have. I didn't even talk about Jennifer. Can you believe we made it through a queer horror episode and I didn't even talk about Jennifer's body?
I mean, you're gonna have to do an entire episode on
It
Jennifer's
does have to
body,
be its
so
own episode. So for all the queer femme people right now that are like, where the hell was Jennifer Check? I promise it's coming. It's
it's
just so
coming.
near and dear to me that it needs its whole own moment. But yeah, that is all I have on that for today. Thank you so much for listening. And especially, also, I just want to say a special thank you to any of our people who are listening who are not queer and are just great allies. Thank you for listening to episodes like this and hopefully learning something, and share that with other people because it's important, especially
Yes.
during
Spread the
Pride Month and
love.
every month. Yes. Um, if you would like to tell us how much you like this podcast, we would sure love that. And you can do that by leaving us a review, if you are able to, on your podcatcher of choice. If not, we do accept them through messages, through comments on Podbean, from wherever you can reach us. We'll happily take those. And I believe, Penny, you have a uniquely submitted review for us today.
I do. I do. Yes, this review comes through our Podbean comments, and it is
Woo!
from Keji, who says 5 out of 5 screams. Spiders, poison, and Asquatch. Oh my. Penny and Midge make reliving your childhood with so many spooky facts and casual conversation that I've learned from this podcast. Thanks for making me look cool in front of my friends. I especially love the trivia episode and the ones about weird superstitions. Thanks for the laugh, schools.
I completely forgot about Asquatch until this moment.
Asquatch, Asquatch. Somebody messaged me about Asquatch the other day, and I was like,
Well, somebody has
you.
to.
You again.
You again. My old friend.
My old enemy.
My old. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for reminding us of Asquatch. And leave us your reviews because we love to read them and they bring us back fond memories of the past.
Yes. So many fond memories.
If you are wanting to see more content from us, or if you're wanting to send us those messages, you can find us on Instagram at Ghouls Night in Pod. And if you are looking for me, you can find me across the interwebs at Midge Munster.
And you can find me at Penny Snark.
And until next time,
Goodbye.